Hi friends, welcome to my channel. My name's Fiddle. Today we were supposed to start building the third floor, but there's been a slight change in the plans. I ordered the wrong size corrugated plastic and there's not enough of it for me to build the third floor. I still need to order more and it's gonna be a little bit, so I figured we might as well start the furniture. And because the third floor is pretty much just Jack's bedroom, I figured we would start with the bed and all the things that go with it first. And as always, don't forget to check the link in the description. That would take you to the Scavenger Hunt, where you'll find the list of materials and a free printable pattern so you can make this bed along with me. Okay, are you ready? Let's go. And this is actually attempt number 2 for me. For the first one that I started to make, I used floral wire for the main frame of the bed and copper wire for the wrapping. And I ended up running out. I did have some speaker wire and I did attempt to use that, but it just looked horrible with the other wire mixed in with it, and it wasn't strong enough to hold everything in place, even though I bulked it up and was using 3 strands equivalent to 1. So I set it aside and decided to start over, but I needed to figure out what my new materials were going to be. I dug through my stash and found fairy lights that I had cut off from past projects. I was just hoping that in between each light was long enough for me to be able to get good wraps in. And for the most part it did work, but trying to wrap around 3 pieces of the armature wire was a little much for it. Oh, also, did you know you can make a slug out of fairy lights? I have no idea when I'll use it, but I now have a little slug. But anyway, I cut down the fairy lights so that way I had some nice wire to work with. But for you making it, I would suggest something like a thin jeweler's wire over fairy lights. That way you can use longer pieces and get more wraps. This was definitely one of those projects for me where you use what you have instead of going out and buying more. Getting a little resourceful in reusing things. For the framework of the bed, the floral wire worked well, but it was pretty hard to cut, and I just got these nippers and they had a hard time getting through it. I did decide to use some scrap armature wire, but I reconditioned it with an old rag first. Okay, now that my wire's ready, we can start building the bed. The first part we're going to make is the overall mattress shape of the bed frame. We'll be using the front page to our pattern guide, and we don't need to cut these pieces out, we're just using them to trace the lines with our wire. Starting with the dot at the top of your pattern, work your way bending the wire all the way around until your ends meet back up. And where they meet up, we want a little bit of overlap and to trim off the rest. Then using a piece of thinner wire, wrap around the 2 ends together to hold it in place. The best way to get good wraps is not to overlap one that you've already done. Try to keep them consecutive and next to each other. Usually I go 3 wraps and then smush it all together and then go 3 wraps and then smush it all together. But with this wire I was lucky to get 4 wraps out of 1 strand. Once your wrap is good enough to hold it in place, set it aside and we're going to move on to cutting the post for the head and the footboard. If your wire ends are a little pokey from cutting them, you can use a nail file or a sandpaper to sand them down. And that goes for all gauges of wire. Okay, now that we have our posts cut, we're going to work on making the detailed parts. I'll only be showing you how I made the headboard because the footboard is the same process and we have a lot of things to make for this bed. For this part of the bed, we're going to start it just like we did the rectangle portion, where the black dot is for the ends of the wire. Except for this time, we need our ends to meet exactly with no overlap. For the next part of the bed, we're going to make the support brackets for both the head and footboard. To make sure that your ends are the same length, you can use graph paper or your graphed mat to line them up and then cut the excess off. Okay, the next pieces we're making are the inside post with the teardrops. Starting with the outside ones first. Add a little bit of flare at the top of the wire and then start bending it into shape. When you get to the bottom end, you'll want to keep it as straight as possible until you're ready to go up into the next curve. And this post is quite a bit shorter than the other end was. Trim off the excess, and next we're going to make the center piece, using the same method that we did for the first one. When you reach the other end, don't forget to put the wiggle in it. Okay, now that we have the bed pieces bent in the right shape, we need to add the teardrop shape on the end of the horseshoe shaped pieces. I did use resin for this, but if you are not comfortable using resin, you could use super glue and baking soda, but you might have to add a layer of tacky glue over top to smooth it out. Or you could just use tacky or wood glue on its own, just letting it dry in between each layer until you have it build up to the way you want it to look. We will be painting over these ends, so if you do use glue, it's okay if it's not clear, see-through or anything. That won't matter. Now that we've got all of our pieces shaped and the teardrops on the end, we're ready to start wire wrapping this piece together. Starting with the headboard teardrop pieces first. To make this junction its sturdiest, we want to fill this whole little section in with our wraps. And tighter is definitely better here. To get your ends laying down so that way they're not pokey, you can use a pair of pliers to finish wrapping the very end. The next piece we're going to attach is the rounded one, and to hold it in place we're going to wrap around it and the larger of the teardrop pieces on both sides. And just like we did with our first connection, we want to fill the area in with wraps for all of the spaces. And next is the leg support piece. To secure this one, we're going to wrap around the circle piece and the support at both ends. And finally, it's time to attach the two side posts. For this one, we need to wrap around the support and the circle thing on both sides. Just to make sure that the top part of our teardrop pieces stay in place, we need to wrap around them and the top part of the headboard in an X pattern. To make it look more uniform, use the same process that you did on the first one for the rest of them. Before we start putting the rest of the bed together, let's give our hands a break and put our upside down bead caps on our headboard posts. These will act as our candle holders. I use super glue and baking soda, but you could also use something like E6000. Now we're ready to put the rest of the bed frame together by using our L-shaped support pieces. These pieces go along the long side of the bed and attach to our posts. You'll also want to use pretty long pieces of wire here, so that way you can wrap the full length of the L shape. Next, add the beads to the headboard feet and both of the top and bottom posts of the footboard. I almost forgot about them. We're almost finished with the bed frame, but this is what mine looks like so far. As you can see, I did add a bit of wrapping around all of the pieces of wire in the center there, but you do not have to necessarily do that. I did this because my wire is so thin and I had to use so many different pieces. We have one last thing to add to the bed frame before we can call it done, and that is the mattress support wires. I think I added 5 or 6 on mine. and 3 or 4 wraps per side should do. And now we're ready to paint. I'm using a metallic antique gold, but if you have a metallic spray paint, that would be so much better than using acrylic. Eventually this will chip off at some point, especially where the wire wraps are. With spray paint that may not happen as much, or at all. There are a whole bunch of different ways to make candles, including using real wax. And I have a few different tutorials already on different ways to make them. For these candles, I decided to use cut-off bits from a pipette, or you could even use coffee straws or even wooden dowels. Cut them to the length that you want and paint them white. Let them completely dry before moving on to the super glue and baking soda. To turn these straws into candles, we're going to use baking soda and super glue to build it up and to close up the top of the straw. Add a little bit of super glue and then dip it into the baking soda. Keep repeating until you have it the way you want. For the wick of the candle, I completely improvised. My choices were wire or my raggedy rag that has strings hanging off. I went for the latter and colored it with a black permanent marker. Glue the wick in place with some super glue. This is what one of mine look like up close. Now we're ready to attach the candles to the bedpost, using the same method with the baking soda and super glue. This will also make it look like there's a buildup of wax on the bottom of the tray. Unfortunately, it looks like we're running out of time, and I'm gonna have to split this tutorial up into 2 parts. But the last thing we need to do is paint over our super glue and baking soda so it matches the candle and looks uniform. And with that, it brings us to the end of our tutorial. I'm sorry I had to cut it shorter than I expected, but we will finish it in the next one. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate you. If you're new, welcome. I'm glad you're here. If you haven't already, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment. Thank you, Ginger, and I'll see you next time.